Aloha, scholars. Welcome back. I hope you found the Action Potential movie to be inspired and helpful. In this video, I'm going to talk about the energy part of it. So, just to refresh your memory, I don't know how long it's been since you watched the last video, but in the last video, we talked about how skeletal muscle contraction is a lot like a jockey riding a horse. There are two things that happen leading to the horse to move. You have the jockey cracking the whip, which causes the horse to be startled and the horse starts running. But if you just hit a dead horse, there's an old adage called beating a dead horse. It's not a very nice adage, but it does exist. Um, well, you're not going to really go anywhere with that. So, um, the two paths leading, or the two things required in order for muscle contraction to take place, are the action potential, but also energy that comes in the form of ATP. So last video talked a lot about the action potential. This video is going to talk about the energy that allows muscle contraction to take place. So one final note about action potentials: they are all created equally. They are all or none events. They either happen or they don't. So there's no such thing as a strong action potential. So, but you've noticed that you have had extreme pain before as one example of an action potential. Well, all that's happening there is you're having more action potentials. So another thing that's required is a threshold stimulus. So if the initial stimulus is not enough, then there won't be a action potential. Moving along, though, to talk about how ATP powers muscle contraction. And ATP, I know they're your three favorite letters strung together, but ATP is basically the currency in a cell. So I think of ATP kind of like, I'll show a prop here. ATP, or glucose, is, kind of like a checkbook. You know, um, it's a promise of money, but I can't take a check written to me in my name and go to Wendy's and say I would like to get a frosty, with this check. Um, they would look at me like I'm crazy. One, because the check isn't even made out to Wendy's, but in order for me to use the money in a check, I have to convert it into a form that's more useful. So, likewise, when you eat food, you have to convert it into something that's more useful for your bodies. And that usually comes in the form of ATP. So ATP provides the energy to move cross bridges, open calcium pumps, and move sodium and potassium back where they belong during repolarization, because remember, this is an active transport mechanism, and we're moving these um, against the grain, so to speak. Um, so at any given time, you only have about 4 to 6 seconds worth of ATP, and ATP is the only source that's used for contraction. So you have to be able to make ATP, and there are three different ways to do it. And all three are used by your body. You have direct phosphorylation, anaerobic respiration, and aerobic respiration. So direct phosphorylation and creatine phosphate, as it turns out, is the fastest, easiest, cheapest, and quickest way to make ATP. And it's super easy to understand. In fact, it doesn't even require glucose. You literally can make energy without glucose, which is kind of neat, right? You've probably never learned about this one before. So what happens is creatine kinase phosphorylates ADP into ADP, which releases creatine. You may have heard about creatine. It's common in the kidneys. It's a common biomarker for kidney function. Unfortunately, it's only going to give you enough energy for about 15 seconds. So that's it. So that's probably why you've never heard of creatine kinase or direct phosphorylation, because its energy yield is so low that we oftentimes ignore it. Now, the anaerobic pathway is next. And I like thinking of anaerobic and aerobic in terms of exercise. I think I mentioned this in my intro video. I've been trying to go to the gym, although these past couple days I've been lazy. That's been really nice. Um, but I'll go back tomorrow, and tomorrow is leg day. God help me. I don't know if you've ever participated in leg day before, but it's awful in pretty much every way imaginable. Um, I'll be doing some squats and deadlifts and these things called good mornings, which I assure you do not lead to good mornings. But at any rate, you're going to use anaerobic respiration when your body is using energy more quickly than it can reproduce it. So there's two more pathways, anaerobic and aerobic. Aerobic respiration is going to give you a lot of ATP, but it takes a while. Anaerobic respiration gives you a very small amount of ATP, but you can do it really quickly. So, when your body goes through creatine phosphate, which it will do so very quickly, you need to make more ATP. And you especially need to make more ATP if you're doing any sort of weightlifting. So, you do have glucose sticking around in your muscle cells. You store glucose and you also store glycogen, which is really nice. And the first part of both the aerobic and the anaerobic pathway is this thing called glycolysis. If you break that word down, glyco means sugar, lysis means to break. So you're taking sugar and you're breaking it. And it gets broken down into glucose is a 6 carbon sugar. Kind of looks like a hexagon. You probably remember that from your Bio 1 class. And it breaks it down into these 2 3 carbon molecules called pyruvate. And as you do this, you generate a net yield of 2 ATP. Now, normally what happens is pyruvate is going to enter the mitochondria and aerobic respiration will take place. But if oxygen isn't available because you're using energy more quickly than your blood can deliver it to the muscles, aerobic respiration cannot take place. So if you're working too hard for it to be pumped through your body, such as during strength training or anaerobic exercise, um, you have to stop there. So unfortunately, what ends up happening is that pyruvate gets converted into lactic acid. So when you're doing strength training and you're sore for a couple days, like my arms are still sore from when I did some arm workouts on Friday, um, they're still sore because pyruvate got converted into lactic acid. So my muscles, after working out, and your muscles as well, literally are taking a bath in lactic acid. It is a type of acid, um, and your muscles are sore because they're taking a bath in acid. Now, it's a shame that we are not like yeast cells. If we were like yeast cells, what would end up happening is instead of converting it into lactic acid, we would convert it into ethanol. And when we would work out, we would get super lit. If only we were like yeast. Um, I used to work out with with a former student, and he would always say that if that happened, no one would get anything done. But I think that would be a pretty nice incentive. Like, you wouldn't have to go out and buy alcohol, and as you're doing squats, you're starting to feel a little tipsy. I would imagine that it would also make you very sick. So, I guess we'll have to deal with lactic acid because I know foresee ourselves evolving in the near future to be able to make ethanol instead of lactic acid. But if you ever wondered how beer gets made in yeast cells, uh, that's how it goes. Now the good news is that the liver cells are going to be able to convert lactic acid back into pyruvate. It just takes a while for it to get transported throughout your blood. Um, it does give you energy very quickly, but it is super inefficient. You only get 2 ATP instead of 32. And that's a bummer. So that's the anaerobic pathway. Now, in the aerobic pathway, what ends up happening is that those 2 pyruvate molecules are going to enter the mitochondria. So far, we're hanging out in the cytoplasm. The next thing that happens is that it's going to go through the Krebs cycle, which has a whole bunch of different names. The citric acid cycle, tricarboxylic acid cycle, TCA cycle, whatever the heck you want to call it. Doesn't matter. But pyruvate will go through a bunch of chemical reactions until it's broken down into CO2. And yes, dear friends, this is why you exhale carbon dioxide. Um, and it generates a number of electron carriers, which then carry electrons to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain pumps electrons through ATP synthase, which basically moves like a turbine, and generating a whole bunch of ATP. The only reason that you need to breathe at all, that literally the only reason, is because oxygen is required. And the only thing that oxygen does in this whole process is it sits at the end of the electron carrier. So it sits at the end of ATP synthase and accepts hydrogen ions, which it then uses to make water. That's it. However, you get a lot of ATP from this process, making a total of about 32 ATP for one glucose. If you do the math, you end up making somewhere in the order of times 10 to the 24th power, which I believe puts us in quintillion land. It's a huge number. ATP a day. I mean, you make a lot of ATP in a given day, times 10 to 24th power. It's a lot of ATP. So just to review, direct phosphorylation converts creatine phosphate into creatine through the enzyme creatine kinase, which phosphorylates ADP into ATP. The anaerobic pathway is going to take a glucose and break it down into pyruvate, and it gets converted into lactic acid when oxygen is not available. The aerobic pathway, when oxygen is available, is going to generate a whole bunch of ATP. Now, one other thing I want to point out, and this is going to be something I mention a lot throughout the rest of 102, there are many, many ways to generate ATP. A lot. You've only learned about how to make ATP from glucose, but it is important right now for you to see that both fats and proteins can be made into ATP. So you have a little bit of ATP stored in muscles. Then the next thing that'll happen is direct phosphorylation will take place. The anaerobic pathway would be used for like a quick, high intensity exercise like a sprint or anaerobic workouts. If you were, on the treadmill or the elliptical and doing a lot of cardio workouts, the ATP is able to be generated through the aerobic pathway, which is why you don't usually get sore after doing like the elliptical. If you've ever wondered why running or walking doesn't really make you sore, it's because you're able to metabolize that glucose really, really efficiently, and you don't have that buildup of lactic acid. The rest of the PowerPoint, I think, is pretty clear, and you'll be able to read through it on your own. I did just want to point out that you have a variety of these slides, which are really nice for you to learn about the similarities and differences between smooth skeletal and cardiac muscle when it comes to muscle contraction. They are slightly different. We'll talk about them later as they become more important. In 102, we'll mention them in the cardiovascular system as well as the digestive system. So that's all for making ATP. Have a great cup night.